Why was the Persian Gulf War important?
The Six-Week War, telecast around the world from start to finish, February-April 1991. Was significant because it was the first major international crisis to take place in the post-Cold War era. The United Nations proved to be effective in organizing the coalition against aggressor Iraq. Leading members of the coalition included Egypt, France, Great Britain, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the United States. The conflict also tested the ability of the United States and the Soviet Union, then still in existence as such, to cooperate in world affairs.
Who were the Habsburgs?
The Habsburgs were Europe's most powerful royal family. Even if one chose to argue the point of power, there can be no arguing the longevity of the House of Habsburg. They supplied Europe with a nearly uninterrupted stream of rulers for more than 600 years. Also spelled Habsburg, which is closer to the pronunciation, Habsburg. The name came from the castle of Habichtsburg, meaning Hawk's Castle, built during the early 11th century in Switzerland. The first member of the family to bear the name was Count Werner I, who died in 1096. It was Werner's descendant, Rudolf I, 1218–1291. Who was elected King of Germany and the Holy Roman Empire in 1273, when Rudolf conquered Austria 3 years later. He established that country as the family's new home. Austria, Bohemia, Germany, Hungary, and Spain were among the European states ruled by the House of Habsburg. With only one exception, the Habsburg family also ruled the Holy Roman Empire from 1438, when Albert II was elected, until 1806. It was the reign of Emperor Charles V. During the 16th century that the Habsburg influence reached its high water mark, when in 1496 Spain's Philip I, called Philip the Handsome, 1478–1506, married Joan of Castile. 1479–1555, it assured that their son Charles V, 1500–1558, would inherit the crown of Spain, which he did in 1516. Charles was grandson to Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. He also inherited the rest of what by then was a vast empire, and he ruled as Holy Roman Emperor from 1519 until 1556. Charles V is considered the greatest of all the Habsburgs, though he did face problems. Chief among these were the Protestant Reformation, opposition from his lifelong rival, Francis I. 1494–1547, King of France, and the Ottoman Turks, who were at the height of their power during his reign. Nevertheless, he was a successful ruler and his accomplishments included Spain's conquest of lands in the New World Mexico at the hands of Hernán Cortés, 1485–1547, and Peru, by Francisco Pizarro, c. 1475–1541. In 1867 the Habsburg Empire was reorganized as the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. That monarchy was dissolved in 1918, after World War I. With the Treaty of Versailles establishing new boundaries for the successor states.
Why were Spain's King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella so powerful?
The 1469 marriage of Ferdinand, 1452–1516, and Isabella, 1451–1504, brought previously separate Spanish kingdoms, Aragon and Castile, under their joint control. Together the monarchs went on to rule Spain and expand their realm of influence until Isabella's death in 1504. Ferdinand ruled without his wife thereafter. Theirs was a reign that seemed to have religion on its side. In 1496 Pope Alexander VI conferred upon each of them the title Catholic, as in, Ferdinand the Catholic and Isabella the Catholic. And for good reason, because the kings and queens most well-known acts seem to have been motivated by their beliefs. It was Ferdinand and Isabella who in 1478 established the infamous Spanish Inquisition, a court that imprisoned or killed Catholics who were suspected of not following religious teachings. While the Inquisition was aimed at discovering and punishing Muslims and Jews who had converted to Catholicism but who were thought to be insincere, soon all Spaniards came to fear its power. In 1482 the monarchs undertook a war with the Muslim Moors, conquering the last Moorish stronghold at Granada in 1492, and forcing them back to Africa after 4 centuries of occupation and influence in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. The recovery of Iberia had been motivated by religion, when the king and queen expelled the Moors. They also believed they were expelling Islam from their kingdom. That year, 1492, was a fateful one for the Spanish. Not only were the Moors driven out, but Ferdinand and Isabella also turned their attention to the Jewish threat, expelling them, too. Those who remained went underground with their faith. Those Iberian Jews who migrated spread their division of Judaism, called Sephardim, to North Africa and the Middle East. Most students of history know 1492 best as the year that explorer Christopher Columbus, 1451–1506, sailed to the New World. It was Ferdinand and Isabella who sponsored his voyage, believing that the conquered lands would not only add to their authority but would provide new territory for the spread of Catholicism. The Spaniards soon emerged as a formidable sea power in the Atlantic. For all their fervor, Isabella and Ferdinand were also interested in education and the arts, and they sponsored advances in both areas during their reign. Their legacy included their grandson Charles V, 1500–1558, who, through marriage, became Holy Roman Emperor and ruled from 1519 to 1558 as one of the all-powerful Habsburgs.
Why is Charlemagne so well known?
Charlemagne's popularity with history students is due not only to the ruler's great accomplishments during his lifetime, but also to the fact that these accomplishments were documented. His biography, titled Vita Caroli Magna, The Life of Charlemagne, was written by a fellow named Einhard, c. 770 to 840, who was his advisor. Charlemagne, 742 to 814, or Charles the Great, became king of the Western Franks when his father, Pepin the Short, c. 714 to 768, died in 768. Upon the death of his brother Carloman, in 771, Charles became king of all the Franks. He then went on to conquer much of Western Europe, including Saxony, Lombardy, northeastern Spain, and Bavaria. He sometimes employed brutal tactics in bringing people and regions under control. During the last 2 decades of the 8th century, he used mass executions to subdue Saxon rebellions. Charlemagne succeeded in uniting all of these areas under one empire. And on Christmas Day 800, he had Pope Leo III, c. 750 to 816, crown him Emperor of the West, thus initiating the Holy Roman Empire. As a patron of the arts, literature, and science, Charlemagne revived Western Europe, which had been in decline since the fall of the West Roman Empire, in 476. He is credited with laying the foundation for the Holy Roman Empire and the European civilization that developed later in the Middle Ages. He ruled until his death in 814.
What were the Articles of Confederation?
This American document was the forerunner to the U.S. Constitution, 1788. Drafted by the Continental Congress at York, Pennsylvania. On November 15, 1777, the Articles of Confederation went into effect on March 1, 1781, when the last state, Maryland, ratified them. The Articles had shortcomings that were later corrected by the Constitution. They provided the states with more power than the central government, stipulating that Congress rely on the states both to collect taxes and to carry out the acts of Congress. It is largely thanks to Alexander Hamilton, 1755 to 1804, that the Articles were thrown out. Realizing they made for a weak national government, Hamilton led the charge to strengthen the central government even at the expense of the states. Eventually, he won the backing of George Washington, 1732 to 1799, James Madison, 1751 to 1836, John Jay, 1745 to 1829, and others, which led to the convening of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, where the ineffectual Articles of Confederation were thrown out and the Constitution was drafted. One lasting provision of the Articles of Confederation was the Ordinance of 1787, signed in an era of westward expansion. The ordinance set the guidelines for how a territory could become a state. A legislature would be elected as soon as the population had reached 5,000 voting citizens, which were men only. And the territory would be eligible for statehood once its population had reached 60,000.
What is the Irish question?
The Irish question is an ages-old and very complicated problem that encompasses issues of land ownership, religion, and politics between Ireland and Britain. The chronology of events is, 12th century, a feudal landowning system is imposed on Ireland by the British, creating an absentee landlord class and an impoverished Irish peasantry. 1700s, the English try to impose Protestantism on a largely Catholic Ireland, Irish rebellions flare. 1801, the Act of Union unites England and Ireland, forming the United Kingdom. Though Ireland has representation in Parliament, it is divided. 1800s, the British Crown begins to populate the 6 counties of the northeastern Irish province of Ulster with Scottish and British settlers, giving the area a decidedly Protestant character. The division deepens between the 26 counties of Southern Ireland and Ulster. The north becomes increasingly industrialized and Protestant, while the south remains agricultural and Catholic. 1840s, Irish discontent with British rule heightens when a great famine strikes Ireland, resulting in widespread hunger, illness, and death. Many who survive emigrate to seek a better life elsewhere. 1858, a secret revolutionary society forms in Ireland and among Irish emigrants in the United States. Called the Fenian Movement, the group's objective is to achieve Irish independence from England by force. Fenians stage rebellions, which are suppressed by the British. 1868, the head of the Liberal Party, William Gladstone, 1809 to 1898, becomes British Prime Minister. He will be Prime Minister 3 more times during the last 4 decades of the century. Gladstone becomes an advocate for the peaceful settlement of the Irish question. 1870, Parliament passes the First Land Act, encouraging British landlords to sell land and providing reduced rate loans to Irish tenants wishing to buy land. 1875, Irish nationalist leader C.S. Parnell, 1846 to 1891, enters British Parliament. He uses filibusters to prevent Parliament from discussing anything but the Irish question. 1886. C.S. Parnell forms an alliance with Prime Minister William Gladstone. The first Home Rule Bill, providing for Irish self-government, is introduced in Parliament but fails to pass. 1893, the second Home Rule Bill is introduced in Parliament. It is passed by the House of Commons but fails to be passed by the Lords. 1905, an Irish nationalistic movement called Sinn Féin, meaning we ourselves, forms under the leadership of Arthur Griffith, 1872 to 1922. The group seeks to establish an economically and politically independent Ireland. 1912, the Third Home Rule Bill is introduced in Parliament. Again, the House of Commons passes the legislation providing for Irish self-government. Fearing domination by Catholic Southern Ireland in the event of Irish Home Rule. There is agitation including threat of civil war in Ulster, Northern Ireland. To prevent the outbreak of violence, the Lords exclude Ulster, Ireland from the provisions of the Home Rule Bill. It does not take effect due to continued unrest. 1916, refusing to accept the divided Ireland proscribed by the British Parliament, revolutionary Sinn Féin member Michael Collins. 1890 to 1922, organizes a guerrilla movement led by the Irish Republican Army, IRA. The nationalist organization becomes dedicated to the unification of Ireland. 1920, Parliament passes the Government of Ireland Act, establishing separate domestic legislatures for the North and South, as well as continued representation in British Parliament. The 6 northern counties of Ireland accept the Act and become Northern Ireland. The 26 southern counties refuse to accept the legislation. 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty is signed, providing for the 26 counties of Southern Ireland to become the Irish Free State, now the Republic of Ireland. 1922, the Irish Free State, headed by Sinn Féin leader Arthur Griffith, is officially declared. It gradually severs its ties to Britain. 1927, Sinn Féin ends as a movement, but some intransigent members join the IRA. And Sinn Féin becomes the political arm of the Irish Revolutionary Army. 1939 to 45, IRA violence and its pro-German stance cause both Irish governments to outlaw the organization, which goes underground. 1969, the IRA splits into an official majority, which disclaims violence, and a provisional wing, which stages attacks on British troops in Northern Ireland via random bombings and other terrorist acts. Still determined to forge a unified and independent Ireland, the IRA continues to stage acts of violence into the 1990s. At times, bombings become part of everyday life in Belfast, Northern Ireland. London is also the target of random IRA bomb attacks. June 6, 1996, Britain and Ireland agree on an agenda for multi-party peace negotiations on Northern Ireland, but finding ways to disarm Northern Ireland's rival guerrilla groups remains an obstacle to political settlement. April 10, 1998, a Good Friday Peace Accord is signed by Catholic and Protestant leaders who agree to form a multi-party administration by October. Disarmament will remain a sticking point to moving this agreement forward. May 22, 1998, 71% of voters in Northern Ireland vote for an agreement on a power-sharing government, which is also backed by 94% of the voters in the Republic of Ireland. The peace agreement is designed to heal the divisions between Catholics and Protestants that have left 3,400 dead, 40,000 injured, and millions of dollars of property damage. Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern, 1951. Has a simple message for those who still aim to promote violence: forget it. The people on whose behalf you claim to act have spoken. Your ways are the ways of the past. August 15, 1998, violence is renewed when a car bomb in Omagh, Northern Ireland, kills 28 people and injures 220. The real IRA. A dissident faction of the Irish Republican Army, claims responsibility. October 16, 1998, the leaders of Northern Ireland's two main political parties win the Nobel Prize for their efforts to end 3 decades of religious-inspired violence in the British province. John Hume, 1937, a Catholic, heads the Social Democratic and Labour Party, whose membership is predominantly Roman Catholic. David Trimble, 1944. A Protestant, leads the Ulster Unionist Party, consisting of pro-British Protestants. December 1998, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953. Tries to jump-start the stalled Good Friday peace agreement. Catholic and Protestant politicians have failed to set up the multi-party administration to which they had agreed. Leaders have been hampered in their efforts to do so by the question of disarmament. Protestants demand exclusion of the Sinn Féin party from government until its military wing, the IRA, disarms. Blair also presses for North-South bodies, committees that will oversee cooperation between the Irish Republic and Northern Ireland on matters of industry, tourism, and transportation. Blair insists that his government will hold all parties to a May 2000 disarmament deadline. 2000, the disarmament deadline is not met. October 23, 2001, the IRA promises to disarm in order to save the peace process. 2002, the peace process is suspended after police discover that the IRA is operating a spy ring inside Northern Ireland government offices. Sporadic violence continues. Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern and other major political figures in the Republic of Ireland move to distance themselves from Sinn Féin, the IRA's political arm. December 2004, Belfast's Northern Bank is robbed of $50 million the week before Christmas. The biggest heist in the history of British crime is believed to have been carried out by the IRA to fund its operations. Early 2005, despite the Good Friday Agreement, the IRA has not yet disarmed. According to news reports, IRA gunmen have become an increasingly mafia-like crime organization, involved in drug trafficking, extortion, money laundering, and the violence associated with those criminal activities. In a January 30 Belfast pub brawl, Robert McCartney, an amiable forklift operator, is murdered in what the perpetrators tell pub patrons is IRA business. Though witnesses are intimidated, McCartney's sisters are not. The 5 women demand that the IRA be held accountable for the slaying. The McCartney sisters are hailed as heroes for their courage to speak out against the IRA and are embraced by Sinn Féin. but Sinn Féin's electoral prospects dimmed in the aftermath of the murder. The event provides another roadblock to peace. July 2005, the IRA renounces the use of violence in its fight against British rule in Northern Ireland. The group vows to disarm and to use only peaceful means in its ongoing efforts. The announcement is widely hailed.
Who are considered the founding fathers of the United States?
The term is used to refer to a number of American statesmen who were influential during the revolutionary period of the late 1700s. Though definitions vary, most include the authors of the Declaration of Independence and the signers of the U.S. Constitution among the nation's founding fathers. Of the 56 members of the Continental Congress who signed the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776. The most well-known are John Adams, 1735–1826, and Samuel Adams, 1722–1803, of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin, 1706–1790, of Pennsylvania, John Hancock, 1737–1793, of Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, of Virginia. The 39 men who signed the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787, include notable figures such as George Washington, 1732–1799, who would go on, of course, to become the first President of the United States. Alexander Hamilton, 1755–1804, who, as a former military aide to George Washington, went on to become the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and James Madison, 1751–1836. Who is called the father of the Constitution for his role as negotiator and recorder of debates between the delegates. At 81 years of age, Benjamin Franklin was the oldest signer of the Constitution and was among the 6 statesmen who could claim the distinction of signing both it and the Declaration of Independence. The others were George Clymer, 1739–1813, Robert Morris, 1734–1806, George Read, 1733–1798, Roger Sherman, 1721–1793, and James Wilson, 1742–1798. Patriots and politicians conspicuous by their absence from the Constitutional Convention of 1787 were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were performing other government duties at the time and would each go on to become U.S. President. Samuel Adams and John Jay, 1745–1829. Who were not appointed as state delegates but who continued in public life, holding various federal and state government offices, including governor of their states, and Patrick Henry, 1736–1799, of Virginia, who saw no need to go beyond the Articles of Confederation, 1777, to grant more power to the central government. Henry's view on this issue foreshadows the discontent that crested nearly 100 years later when 12 Southern states including Virginia, seceded from the Union, causing the Civil War, 1861–65, to break out. Adams, Franklin, Hancock, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and Henry. These are the names that come to mind when the words Founding Fathers are uttered. Each of them had a profound impact in the political life of the United States even beyond their starring roles as patriots and leaders during the American Revolutionary era. However, it's important to note that in many texts and to many Americans, the term Founding Fathers refers only to the men who drafted the U.S. Constitution, since it is that document that continues more than 200 years after its signing to provide the solid foundation for American democratic government.
What was Black Hawk Down?
Though the U.S. military uses the term to communicate any crash of one of its Black Hawk helicopters, the phrase is closely associated with events in Mogadishu, Somalia, on October 3, 1993. The term became synonymous with that day after American journalist Mark Bowden wrote a book, by the same title, describing a disastrous U.S. raid on a Mogadishu warlord. The book was turned into a movie in 2001. The background is this. Somalia threw off its colonial constraints in 1960 to become an independent nation. But warring factions within the impoverished East African nation made a stable central government elusive. After staging a 1969 coup, Soviet-influenced army commander Mohammad Syed Bar 1919 or 1921 to 1995, established a military dictatorship in Somalia. His authoritarian rule, which was marked by human rights abuses, lasted until 1991, when he was deposed in a popular uprising. He died in exile 4 years later. The nation of about 8 million people was in chaos, and many were starving. International donations of food were hijacked and used by competing warlords to secure weapons from other nations, thus furthering civil strife. After a 1992 ceasefire, the United Nations sent peacekeepers to Somalia and launched a humanitarian relief operation. Outgoing U.S. President George H.W. Bush, 1924, supported the UN effort by approving a deployment of 25,000 American troops to Somalia to help secure trade routes over which badly needed food supplies could move. In 1993, the United States, then led by President Bill Clinton, 1946, reduced the number of troops to less than half the original deployment. Trouble was ignited on June 5, 1993, when 24 Pakistani soldiers in Somalia as part of the UN operation were killed in an ambush. The warlord thought to be responsible for the massacre was Mohammed Farah Aidid. Somalia's government ordered Aidid's arrest. His capture was an imperative to peace. He and his followers were staging a violent rebellion against the provisional Somali government, led by Aidid rival Ali Mahdi. Over the next several months, UN and US forces launched several attacks on what were believed to be aided clan strongholds, but Aidid himself remained an elusive target. On October 3, US elite forces launched an assault on a Mogadishu hotel believed to be an Aidid hideout. They were met with an ambush. Over the following 17 hours, US troops, including a military mission to rescue downed Black Hawk helicopter crews, engaged in a battle with armed Somalis in the streets of Mogadishu. 18 American servicemen were killed, the bodies of some were dragged through the streets of the city. Another 84 American soldiers were wounded. Hundreds of Somalis were killed in the fighting. Video footage of the chaos was shown on international television. The Battle of Mogadishu, as it is officially called, was the most intense combat firefight experienced by US troops since Vietnam. On October 7, President Clinton signed orders to withdraw all American troops from Somalia. The United States pulled out in 1994, and the UN peacekeepers followed in 1995. Even after a 2002 reconciliation conference, Somalis had not secured a central government by 2004. The country remained impoverished, strife-ridden, and lawless. The UN and other non-governmental organizations, NGOs, worked to provide much-needed humanitarian relief to Somalis. Some military and foreign affairs experts point to the Battle of Mogadishu as a primary reason for American reluctance to engage troops in the world's hotspots in the 1990s.
What was the Doomsday Book?
It is an important document surviving from the reign of England's William I, c. 1028–1087, a Norman who had conquered England in 1066 to become king. He ordered the survey so that he could have a complete record of England's lands, property owners, and resources. He used this information to his advantage, even taking possession of some properties thereafter. The census is considered an excellent record of Europe's Middle Ages, 500–1350.
Who wrote the U.S. Constitution?
In spirit, the U.S. Constitution was created by all of the 55 delegates to the meeting that convened on May 25, 1787. In Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, called the Constitutional Convention an assembly of demigods. And with good cause, the delegates were the young nation's brightest and best. When the states had been called upon to send representatives to the meeting, 12 states answered by sending their most experienced, most talented, and smartest men, Rhode Island, which feared the interference of a strengthened national government in state affairs, sent no one to Philadelphia. Even in such stellar company, the document did have to be written. While many had a hand in this process, it was New York lawyer and future American politician and diplomat Gouverneur Morris, 1752 to 1816, who actually took on the task of penning the Constitution, putting into prose the resolutions reached by the convention. Morris had the considerable help of the records that James Madison, 1751 to 1836, of Virginia had kept as he managed the debates among the delegates and suggested compromises. In that capacity and in that he designed the system of checks and balances among the legislative, Congress, the executive, the President of the United States, and the judicial, Supreme Court. Madison had considerable influence on the document's language, quite rightfully earning him the designation Father of the Constitution. The original document, drafted by Morris, is preserved in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. While the Constitution has been amended by Congress, the tenets set forth therein have remained with Americans for more than 2 centuries, and they have provided proof to the countries of the world that a constitution outlining the principles and purposes of its government is necessary to good government.
What was the Virginia Plan?
It was the famous plan, drafted by James Madison, 1751 to 1836. Put forth by the Virginia delegates to the Constitutional Convention, which convened on May 25, 1787. After taking a few days to set the ground rules and elect officers, on May 29 the delegation from Virginia, led by Edmund Jennings Randolph, 1753 to 1813, proposed a plan to write an all-new constitution. Rather than attempting to revise and correct the weak Articles of Confederation, there was opposition, sometimes called the New Jersey Plan, and the issue was debated for weeks. Eventually, a majority vote approved the Virginia Plan and the delegates began work, drafting a document that would provide a strong national government for the United States.
What were the intolerable acts?
The so-called intolerable acts, also known as the coercive acts, were 5 laws passed by the British Parliament early in 1774, intended to assert British authority in the Massachusetts colony. The measures were seen as punishment for the Boston Tea Party, December 1773. In brief, the laws enacted the following: closure of the port of Boston, an English trial for any British officer or soldier who was charged with murder in the colonies, the change of the Charter of Massachusetts such that the council had to be appointed by the British and that town meetings could not be held without the British appointed governor's permission, the requirement that the colonists house and feed British soldiers, and the extension of the province of Quebec southward to the Ohio River. While the British intention was to bring the Massachusetts colony under control, and actually the Fifth Act was not intended to have any punitive effect on the colony. The result was instead to unite all the colonies in opposition to British rule. In this regard, the Acts are seen as a precursor to the American Revolution, 1775–83.
Why were Tsars Peter and Catherine known as the Great?
The epithet the Great can be misleading, while Romanov Tsars Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, and Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796, are among the best known of the Romanov dynasty, and both had many accomplishments during their reigns. They are also known for having increased their power at the expense of others. Peter is recognized for introducing Western European civilization to Russia and for elevating Russia to the status of a great European power. But he also relied on the serfs, the peasants who were little more than indentured servants to the lords, not only to provide the bulk of the funding he needed to fight almost continuous wars, but for the manpower as well. Most soldiers were serfs. The man responsible for establishing schools, including the Academy of Sciences, reforming the calendar, and simplifying the alphabet also carried out ruthless reforms. Peter's most vainglorious act was, perhaps, to move the capital from Moscow to the city he had built for himself on the swampy land ceded by Sweden, St. Petersburg, known as Petrograd 1914–24, as Leningrad 1924–91. As his window on Europe, Peter succeeded in making the city into a brilliant cultural center. For her part, Catherine the Great may well be acknowledged as a patron of the arts and literature, one who corresponded with the likes of French writer Voltaire, 1694–1778, but she, too, increased the privileges of the nobility while making the lives of the serfs even more miserable. Her true colors were shown by how she ascended to power in the first place. In 1744 she married Peter III, who became Tsar of Russia in 1762. That same year, Catherine conspired with her husband's enemies to depose him. He was later killed. And so Catherine came to power, proclaiming herself Tsarina. She began her reign by attempting reforms, but a peasant uprising, 1773–74, and the French Revolution, which began in 1789, prompted her only to strengthen and protect her absolute authority. Like Peter the Great, she, too, extended the frontiers of the empire through a series of conquests. By the end of her reign, in 1796, Catherine had reduced even the free peasants to the level of serfdom.
What were Napoleon's 100 Days?
The term refers to Napoleon Bonaparte's last 100 days as ruler of France. Having been defeated by his enemies, a coalition of European powers, Britain, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia, who aligned themselves against Napoleon's domination. The emperor abdicated the throne in the spring of 1814, and was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. There he heard of the confusion and discontent that came after he had descended the throne. He left Elba, and with more than 1,000 men, arrived on the French coast at Caen and marched inland to Paris. Hearing of his arrival, the new Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, 1755–1824, fled. On March 20 Napoleon began a new reign, but it was only to last until the European allies defeated him again. At the Battle of Waterloo, June 12–18. After that battle, the so-called Little Corporal, for his diminutive stature, was permanently exiled to the British island of St. Helena, where he remained until his death in 1821.
Why is Henry VIII so famous?
The reign of Henry VIII, from 1509 to 1547, is perhaps the most well-known Tudor monarchy. It was marked by papal conflicts and England's subsequent break with the Roman Catholic Church. When Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, 1485–1536, failed to produce a male heir, he appealed to the Pope to grant him a divorce. The request was of course denied. Though Henry went on to have his marriage to Catherine declared invalid, on the grounds that she was his brother's widow, and he secretly married Anne Boleyn, c. 1507–1536, in 1533, his troubles with the Church continued. In 1534 he set up the Church of England, declaring the monarch as its head. He went to extreme measures to ensure the act was upheld, even executing his appointed chancellor, Sir Thomas More, 1478–1535, for his refusal to acknowledge royal supremacy. Henry VIII was eventually successful in procuring a male heir to the throne, but it required a third marriage, to Jane Seymour, c. 1509–1537. His son, Edward VI, 1537–53, succeeded him in 1547. Nevertheless, it was Henry VIII's daughters who went on to make history. Mary I, who ruled England and Ireland from 1553 to 1558, was the daughter of Henry and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. In 1554 Mary wed Spain's Philip II, 1527 to 1598, forming a temporary alliance between the two powers. The following year she realigned England with the Catholic Church, undertaking the persecution of Protestants and earning herself the name Bloody Mary.
Why is Napoleon still controversial?
Even history has not been able to sort out the widely disparate opinions of the diminutive French ruler. And both the detractors and the champions, or some would say, the apologists, continue to publish their arguments and supporting research. The most obvious point on which scholars differ centers on the fact that, first and foremost, Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, was a military man. Here opinion divides quite naturally. Not long after Napoleon assumed power, in the coup of 1799, he proceeded to keep France and the rest of Europe at war for more than 10 years. From the French perspective, Napoleon was a great man. A brilliant strategist who could not only muster his troops but could keep them motivated to fight one campaign after another. The targets of these campaigns: England, Russia, Austria, Germany, Spain, and Portugal among them, view Napoleon in quite a different light, as would be expected. Researchers from these countries have seen and rendered Napoleon's dark side, calling him a megalomaniac and a psychopath, and even seeing him as a forerunner of Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945. To further complicate the matter of how history views Napoleon, before he declared himself emperor for life in 1804, and launched his military conquests throughout the continent and beyond, 1805. Napoleon enjoyed a brief period in which many Europeans, not just the French, believed him to be a hero. After all, he assumed leadership of France after the hideous period of Robespierre's terror and the ineffectual government of the Directory. And then he proceeded to make peace with the Americans, the Russians, and the British. Many believed Napoleon was just the man to bring order to the chaos France had known since the storming of the Bastille. And he extended an olive branch to France's longtime enemies. It looked like he would restore order at home and abroad. Of course, this honeymoon did not last. By 1805, the leader many had looked to end the turmoil only became the cause of more turmoil. His compulsive war-making, as one writer put it, soon swept over the continent, ultimately uniting various countries in an effort to rid Europe of the scourge that was Napoleon and his Grand Army. Thus, students and readers are left to sort through the diverging accounts of this controversial figure. Napoleon has been called the Emperor of Kings, credited for his vision, insight, courage. And even with the development of the modern liberal democracy, he has also been described as a compulsive tyrant who had an insatiable appetite for battle, a man whose own ambitions left millions dead. But on a few descriptions both sides can agree: he was a brave soldier, an inspired military leader, and, at least for a time, a charismatic ruler.
What are England's royal houses?
England's royal houses are simply families, including ancestors, descendants, and kin. Since 1066, England's rulers have come from a series of 10 royal houses: Normandy, ruled 1066 to 1135, Blois, 1135 to 54, Plantagenet, 1154 to 1399, Lancaster, 1399 to 1471, York, 1471 to 85, Tudor, 1485 to 1603, Stuart. 1603 to 49, restored 1660 to 1714, Hanover, 1714 to 1901, Saxe-Coburg, 1901 to 10, and Windsor, 1910 to present. Prior to the establishment of the House of Normandy, England had been ruled by Saxons and Danes since 802. The first king of the House of Normandy was William I, also known as William the Conqueror c. 1028 to 1087, who was the son of the French Duke of Normandy. William invaded England in 1066 on the death of Edward the Confessor and the accession of Harold II. c. 1022 to 1066. Ousting Harold, William was coronated at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. William's grandson, Stephen, was all that consisted of the short-lived reign of the House of Blois. Named such since Stephen was the Count of Blois and Chartres. Though he was raised in the court of his uncle, King Henry I, whom he succeeded. The House of Plantagenet, also called the House of Anjou, included the 10-year reign 1189 to 99, of Richard I, or Richard the Lion-Hearted, 1157 to 1099, who fought his father Henry II, 1068 to 1135, and his brothers for control of the throne. Richard's military prowess made him the hero of romantic legends. Thereafter, two contending branches of the House of Plantagenet, the houses of Lancaster and York, vied for the crown in the infamous War of the Roses, 1455 to 85. The struggle finally ended when Henry VII, a Lancaster, ascended the throne and married into the House of York, reuniting the two sides of the family under the newly minted House of Tudor. The Tudors were a famous lot, remembered for the reigns of Henry VIII. 1509 to 47, and his daughters, Mary I, 1553 to 1558, and Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603. The Tudors were followed by the Stuarts, whose reign was interrupted by the establishment of the Commonwealth and Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658. The house was restored to power, giving history the 8-year period known as the Restoration. In 1660, it was King William III, 1650 to 1702, a Stuart, and Queen Mary II, 1662 to 1694, who began in 1689 to rule England in a more modern fashion through Parliament. A Stuart descendant, George I, 1660 to 1727, established the House of Hanover, which originated in Germany. Queen Victoria, 1819 to 1901, who presided over the Victorian age, 1837 to 1901, was of the House of Hanover. She was succeeded by her son, Edward VII, 1841 to 1910, who established the House of Saxe-Coburg. Technically, this is the royal house still at the helm today. The name was changed to Windsor during World War I, 1914 to 18.
What happened to Slobodan Milosevic?
Like other Serb leaders involved in the recent Baltic Wars, former Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, 1941, faced charges of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity at the International Court Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, ICTY, in The Hague. He was arrested in Belgrade on April 1, 2001, and transferred to The Hague in June. There he faced 66 counts of war crimes from the Balkan conflicts. Before the ICTY, he pled innocent of 3 indictments against him. One for each major war crimes scene: Kosovo, Croatia, and Bosnia. His trial began on February 12, 2002, and was marked by numerous idiosyncrasies, including Milosevic's attempts to represent himself, without the benefit of counsel, his frequent refusals to cooperate with the court, and numerous days lost to his various illnesses. The prosecution wrapped up its case against him on February 25, 2004. After hearing testimony from almost 300 witnesses. The defense portion of the trial began on August 31, 2004, and was slated to last 150 court days. Not the same as calendar days. As of June 2005, the trial was still underway in The Hague.
What was the Ottoman Empire?
It was a vast Turkish state founded in the 13th century by the Osmani Turks. Turks who were led by descendants of Osman I, 1258 c. 1326, by the middle of the next century, the Ottoman Empire consisted roughly of modern-day Turkey. The terms Turkey and Ottoman Empire are used interchangeably. The empire was expanded further by conquests during the 1400s, including the conquest of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. At its height, the Byzantine Empire extended over an area that included the Balkan Peninsula, present-day Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, Greece, and Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Iraq, the northern coast of Africa, Palestine, and parts of Arabia, Russia, and Hungary. The capital was placed at Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, Turkey. Thus the Turks established a Muslim empire that would remain a formidable force and influence in the region and in Europe for the next 3 centuries. During the 1500s and 1600s, the Ottoman Empire was the most powerful in the world. It reached its most glorious heights during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, 1494 to 1566. Who ruled from 1520 to 1566, it was he who added parts of Hungary to the Ottoman territory. He also tried to take Vienna, but failed. He did succeed in strengthening the Ottoman navy, which dominated the Mediterranean Sea. Suleiman was not only an expansionist, but a patron of the arts and a builder. He ordered the construction of mosques to spread the Islamic religion throughout the empire, bridges, and other public works. but by the time World War I began in 1914, the Ottoman Empire had been in decline for some 300 years and only consisted of Asia Minor, parts of southwestern Asia, and part of the Balkan Peninsula. As one of the losing Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved in 1922 by the peace treaties that ended the war.
How could the world body have allowed such an event to happen? Particularly with the Nazi Holocaust a not too distant memory?
Again, there is no easy answer. The United Nations withdrew its people when the violence began in April 1994, but some UN officials estimated later that perhaps as few as 5,000 troops might have been able to prevent the annihilation. The United States did not intervene in the Rwandan genocide. The recent images of dead American soldiers being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu, Somalia, in October 1993, had left the country reticent to involve itself in the world's hotspots. But, even with the lesson of Rwanda, experts wondered how the international response might differ today.
Who were the Romanovs?
The Romanov family ruled Russia from 1613 until 1917, when Nicholas II, 1868 to 1918, was overthrown by the Russian Revolution, 1905 to 17. The dynasty was established by Michael Romanov, grandnephew to Ivan the Terrible, who ruled from 1533 to 1584. There were 18 Romanov rulers, including the much-studied Peter the Great, who ruled from 1682 to 1725, and Catherine the Great, who ruled from 1762 to 1796. As the last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, who ruled from 1894 to 1917, likely suffered not only the recrimination that was due him, but the public hostility that had accumulated over centuries of ruthless Romanov leadership. Nicholas's difficulties came to a head when he got Russia involved in World War I, 1914-18, which produced serious hardships for the Russian people and for which there was little public support. Once Tsar Nicholas was overthrown, and later killed, in the Russian Revolution, 1905-17, Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin, 1870-1924, set about extracting Russia from the conflict by agreeing to sever concessions to Germany. Oddly enough, the Romanov family had, in the 14th century, originated with a German nobleman, Andrew Kabila, who had emigrated to Russia.
Why were there two continental congresses?
Both meetings were called in reaction to British parliaments attempts to assert its control in the American colonies. When colonial delegates to the First Continental Congress met, they developed a plan but were obviously prepared for it not to work. since even before dismissal they agreed to reconvene if it were necessary to do so. In short, the first Congress developed Plan A, the second resorted to Plan B, which was one last appeal to the king, and then to Plan C, finally declaring independence from Britain. The First Continental Congress convened on September 5, 1774, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The meeting was largely a reaction to the so-called Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, which British Parliament had passed in an effort to control Massachusetts after the rebellion of the Boston Tea Party, December 1773. Sentiment grew among the colonists that they would need to band together in order to challenge British authority. Soon 12 colonies dispatched 56 delegates to a meeting in Philadelphia. The 13th colony, Georgia, declined to send representatives but agreed to go along with whatever plan was developed. Delegates included Samuel Adams, 1722 to 1803, George Washington, 1732 to 1799. Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, John Adams, 1735 to 1826, and John Jay, 1745 to 1829. Each colony had one vote, and when the meeting ended on October 26, the outcome was this. The Congress petitioned the king, declaring that the British Parliament had no authority over the American colonies, that each colony could regulate its own affairs, and that the colonies would not trade with Britain until Parliament rescinded its trade and taxation policies. The petition stopped short of proclaiming independence from Great Britain, but the delegates agreed to meet again the following May if necessary. But King George III, 1738 to 1820, was determined that the British Empire be preserved at all costs. He believed that if the empire lost the American colonies, then there may be a domino effect, with other British possessions encouraged to also demand independence. He feared these losses would render Great Britain a minor state, rather than the power it was. Britain unwilling to lose control in America. In April 1775 fighting broke out between the Redcoats and Patriots at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. So, as agreed, the colonies again sent representatives to Philadelphia. Convening the Second Continental Congress on May 10. Delegates including George Washington, John Hancock, 1737 to 1793. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, and Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790, organized and prepared for the fight. Creating the Continental Army and naming Washington as its commander-in-chief. With armed conflict already underway, the Congress nevertheless moved slowly toward proclaiming independence from Britain. On July 10, 2 days after issuing a declaration to take up arms, Congress made another appeal to King George III, hoping to settle the matter without further conflict. The attempt failed, and the following summer the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, breaking off all ties with the mother country.
How did the House of Tudor originate?
The name of a royal family that ruled England for well over a century, from 1485 to 1603, came from a Welshman, Owen Tudor, who sometime after 1422 married Catherine of Valois, 1401 to 1437, the widow of Henry V, who ruled from 1413 to 1422. The family did not come to power until Henry VII ascended the throne. Ruling from 1485 until his death in 1509, Henry VII, 1457 to 1509, ended the bitter 30-year War of the Roses, during which two noble families, the houses of Lancaster and York, had struggled against each other for control of the throne. The conflict earned its name since the badge of each house depicted a rose, one red and the other white. In taking power, Henry VII became the head of the House of Lancaster, and in 1486 he married into the House of York, thus uniting the two former enemies and founding his own Tudor dynasty. He's known as Henry Tudor.
What was the Carolingian Empire?
The empire, which united most of Western Europe under a single leader from about 734 until 987, was named for the Carolingians, a family of Frankish kings. After the decline of the Roman Empire, in 476, various Germanic tribes, including the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, and the Anglo-Saxons, dominated Western Europe, fighting each other as well as the advancing Muslims to protect and expand their territories. In 719, Charles Martel, c. 688 to 741, united the lands of all the Franks under his rule. The Franks were the descendants of Germanic tribes who settled in the Rhine River region of Western Europe. He then went on to protect France from Arab incursion and campaigned against the Burgundians and the Frisians, eventually bringing them under his control. Upon his death in 741, Charles Martel was succeeded by his son, Pepin III, known better perhaps as Pepin the Short, c. 714 to 768. It was Pepin who established the Carolingian Empire and brought the Lombards into the empire. Upon his death, he was succeeded by his son Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, 742 to 814.
Which states were the original 13?
In order of admission they are Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, and Rhode Island. Vermont was 14th and the first free state, the first state without slavery.
What is the conflict over Chechnya?
Since the 1990s, separatist factions have been fighting for the independence of the tiny Russian Republic. At just more than 6,000 square miles in area, it is about the size of Hawaii. Chechnya's population falls into three main ethnic groups: Chechens, the majority, Ingush, and Russian. The religion of the Chechen and the Ingush peoples is Islam, while the Russian population is mostly Orthodox Christian. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, the region remained with the new Russian Federation as the Chechen Ingush Republic. But dissent grew, and in 1991 a rebel faction led by Jakar Dudayev, 1944 to 1996, took control of the government. Chechnya separated from Ingushetia to form two separate republics in 1992. In 1994, Russian troops invaded to reclaim the Chechen capital of Grozny, an oil and manufacturing center. By this time, two factions existed among the rebels. One was a nationalist movement and the other a fundamentalist Islamic movement. In 1995, the conflict spilled over into neighboring regions, as Chechen militants began a series of terror attacks. In June of that year, gunmen seized a hospital in Budyanovsk, about 90 miles north of the Chechen border, in the Stavropol territory, and held 1,800 people hostage for 6 days. More than 100 people were killed and hundreds were injured. In 1996, Chechen terrorists seized another hospital, holding 2,000 hostages. This time in neighboring Dagestan, at least 23 people were killed. Russia's military strikes in Chechnya continued until a ceasefire was negotiated in 1996, by which time dissident leader Dudayev had been killed. Even after a peace treaty was signed in 1997, ending the First Chechen War, the status of Russia's breakaway republic remained unclear. In 1999, the battle over Chechnya's status was taken straight to the Russian capital of Moscow, where 5 bombings in 4 weeks claimed 300 lives. Islamic militants in Chechnya were blamed. The Kremlin responded with force, leveling Grozny by early 2000 and displacing 250,000 people from their homes. A pro-Moscow administration was put into place. Violence related to the Chechen conflict continued throughout Russia. Suicide bombings alone claimed more than 260 lives between 2002 and 2004. There were large-scale assaults as well. In October 2002, Chechen militants took more than 700 people hostage at a Moscow theater. After a 2-day standoff, Russian special forces stormed the building, killing 41 Chechen fighters and 129 hostages. In August 2004, 2 airliners crashed within minutes of each other after taking off from the same airport. 90 people died in the crashes, which Russian President Vladimir Putin, 1952, labeled terrorism. And on September 1, 2004, 32 armed militants seized an elementary school in Beslan, North Ossetia, a region bordering Chechnya. The terrorists held some 1,200 hostages for 48 hours, at which time Russian forces stormed the building, 335 people died, most of them children. Leaders of the Chechen nationalist movement distanced themselves from the terrorist acts, the responsibility for which were claimed by a militant Chechen Muslim group. Chechnya continued to be unstable, with Putin resolved to a hardline approach to the breakaway republic. In elections held in March 2003, voters reportedly approved a new constitution that declared Chechnya to be part of Russia. But critics found the election results irregular, with almost 96% of voters expressing support for the referendum. Months later, pro-Moscow leadership was elected in the person of Deputy Prime Minister Ramzan Kadyrov. Critics called it a puppet regime. In March 2005, Chechen nationalist leader Aslan Moskatov, 1951–2005, was killed in a Russian assault. His death was seen as a victory for Moscow. Moskatov, who had briefly been president 1997–1999, of an independent Chechnya, was generally viewed as a moderate who believed an honest dialogue between the two sides could bring an end to the decade-long conflict.